Imagine waking up before the sun, putting on a suit so starched it could double as a weapon, and spending your day answering the bell of a man who can't even find his own slippers. Welcome to the Gilded Age, where luxury oozed from every corner, and you, dear butler, were the human doormat. While the Vanderbilts were inventing new ways to waste money, you were figuring out how to serve oysters without sighing audibly. Behind the gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, quiet misery, polished to a blinding shine. If you've ever wondered what it's like to work 16-hour days in silence while being ignored by people in monocles, hit that subscribe. Let's dig into the most repressed job of the century. Welcome to the Gilded Age, a time when America was wearing its fanciest suit and hiding an enormous sweat stain underneath. This was the late 19th century, when tycoons waged silent wars over sugar spoons, and the average home had more mirrors than self-awareness. If you've ever looked at a marble-columned mansion and thought, yes, elegance, just know there was probably a butler inside calculating whether starvation or burnout would kill him first. This was the age of opulence with a capital O, which might as well stand for overcompensation. America, still relatively new to the aristocracy game, decided to copy European grandeur, but with more square footage and significantly worse taste. Think Versailles, but with indoor plumbing and robber barons. Everything, the columns, the chandeliers, the 17 fireplaces screamed, "We're not insecure at all." And in the shadows of these screaming symbols of wealth, stood the butler. Not stood exactly, hovered, glided, dissolved into walls. The butler was the silent metronome of the household, regulating life, suppressing coughs, and pretending not to notice that the lady of the house was 3 champagnes deep before noon. You weren't allowed to blink too loudly, let alone speak. The mansion itself was your stage, a theatre of wealth, and you were the unseen stagehand. And oh, what a stage! The walls were upholstered. Yes, upholstered, with imported silk damask. The ceilings were frescoed with cherubs who looked slightly confused about being born into capitalism. The furniture was French, or at least French-looking if you squinted and ignored the oil stains. And the dining rooms? Let's just say they had more forks per capita than most towns had dentists. But beneath the gold leaf and the alabaster busts, something else lingered. Tension. A constant throbbing social anxiety, dressed up in tuxedos and pearl chokers. The Gilded Age was, after all, a masterclass in pretending to have class, pretending not to care about class, pretending to enjoy pâté when all you wanted was a sandwich and a moment alone. And nowhere was that illusion more carefully maintained than in the presence of the butler. Let's talk about your job. You were the first face guests didn't quite see. You opened doors that had already been knocked on by people more important than you'd ever be. You poured wine without trembling, even as your shoes silently filled with sweat, and at night, you vanished like a magician with arthritis. Because if anyone saw you resting, you were doing it wrong. Your name? Rarely used. Your face? Hopefully forgettable. Your opinion? Dangerous. And yet, you knew everything. You knew which guests weren't actually married. You knew who stole the silver last Christmas. You knew where the bodies weren't buried, but probably should have been. You were omnipresent. Like God. If God ironed shirts and decanted claret. And still you had to maintain a calm, unreadable expression, even when a guest referred to you as what's his name. Even when the master of the house screamed about a wrinkle in his cravat. Even when the maid slipped you a glance that said, "Just once I'd like to throw this soup in his face." Of course, it wasn't all bad. There were perks. Like knowing the inner workings of a wine cellar you weren't allowed to drink from. Or polishing a chandelier so bright it reflected your deep, existential despair back at you in crystal clarity. You might have had a bed, somewhere, in a hallway, next to a boiler, and once a year, if you were lucky, someone might say thank you. Or maybe not. Gratitude, like rest, was reserved for those with drawing rooms. Still, the architecture. Oh, the architecture. Entire mansions built to keep you close but invisible. Secret corridors. Dumbwaiters. Bells that rang in code. Each one summoning you to some new nightmare in formal wear. The entire house was a living organism designed to hide you and use you, like a pair of lungs that wasn't supposed to breathe. Imagine tiptoeing through a drawing room, with a tray full of brandy while a socialite discusses her hatred of help, unaware that the help is holding her glass, trying not to spit in it. Imagine memorizing the preferences of 14 different dinner guests, while remembering that if you mispronounce Hordev, you'll be spoken to like a particularly dim horse. This wasn't service. This was espionage. Domestic espionage, with etiquette manuals and a starched collar. So why did anyone do it? Why become a butler in the Gilded Age? Well, because options were limited, and because even invisible labor offered more dignity than starving. The butler's role, for all its indignities, was one of strange reverence. You were a curator of calm, a conductor of household harmony, a living, breathing mood stabilizer for rich people who couldn't locate the pantry without assistance. But you weren't just managing plates and schedules, you were managing egos. Theirs, yes, but also yours, repressing yourself until your personality folded into your waistcoat, until your own desires were things to be ironed out and hung neatly behind duty. You were the perfect contradiction. Highly skilled, completely replaceable, trusted, but never embraced. Present, but never acknowledged. The butler was less a man, and more a function. A verb. To butler. To suffer gracefully. So yes, the Gilded Age was gilded. All right. Covered in a thin, shiny layer of gold, to distract from the cracks underneath. And no one saw those cracks more clearly than the man holding the tray of oysters, pretending not to listen. Let that sink in, while the mansion whispered of opulence. The butler lived inside its silence. Before you were whispering through marble corridors and arranging shrimp in concentric circles, you were a boy. Probably barefoot, probably in a field, covered in manure, chasing geese, and trying not to get kicked by your uncle's mule. That's where most butlers began. Not at the top of a grand staircase, but at the bottom of society's most charmingly mud-covered ladder. The average Gilded Age butler didn't pop out of the womb polishing silver. He came from the countryside where dreams were small, shoes were optional, and if you wanted upward mobility, it meant climbing over an actual fence to get to a slightly less depressing pasture. You see, the 19th century had a thing for transitions. It turned farmers into factory workers, housemaids into half-literates, and boys who could milk a cow blindfolded into men who could recite the guest list while folding napkins into swans. The Industrial Revolution was remaking society. Machines were replacing muscle. But in the world of elite domesticity, there was still a market for humans who could iron a cravat with the solemnity of a priest blessing communion. And so began the metamorphosis. You were plucked, maybe by a family desperate for income, or a stern mother with dreams of respectability, and sent to serve. But this wasn't just any job. No, this was a calling. A brutal, meticulously folded, eternally buttoned-up calling. The transformation wasn't instant. First, there was training, if you were lucky enough to receive it, not Hogwarts. Think more along the lines of Downton Abbey meets boot camp, only with less shouting and more passive aggression. You learned how to stand, how to walk, how to hold a silver salver with your wrist locked at just the right angle, because God forbid the aspic jiggles before it reaches the table. Some butlers, particularly in England, were sent to servants' schools, which honestly sounds like a Victorian way of saying, you're about to forget how to be a person. These institutions taught the holy trinity of service, posture, deference, and restraint. If you flinched at being yelled at, you failed. If you blinked too much during eye contact, you failed. If you had thoughts, definitely failed. And let's not forget the Holy Grail. Table service. This wasn't just slapping food on plates. No. You had to learn the delicate ballet of formal dining, French service, Russian service, silver service. Each one its own brand of chaos. Imagine trying to spoon potatoes onto someone's plate from the left side while they discussed eugenics and coughed into their napkin. Now, do it with a straight face and make sure the spoon doesn't clink. Ever. Still, the butler's education extended beyond the dining room. You were expected to manage wine cellars, memorize social hierarchies, interpret facial expressions of the upper class, which were all just shades of mild disgust, and most importantly, anticipate needs before they were even spoken. A good butler didn't wait to be told. He sensed, he calculated, he preemptively fluffed. You were like a human algorithm, only sleep-deprived and far more polite. Now, did anyone thank you for this transformation from dirt-stained farmhand to domestic Jedi? Of course not. You were meant to be invisible. A perfectly starched shadow. And worse, the more competent you became, the more you ceased to exist. Excellence in this world didn't earn you freedom. It earned you more work, more responsibility, more whispered gossip about how you were quite a find, as if you were an antique umbrella stand and not a sentient human being. Let's take a quick detour into identity, or the lack thereof. Becoming a butler meant learning to erase yourself. Not in the fun, mysterious, I'm a spy kind of way. In the your personality is now considered a workplace hazard kind of way. Laughter? No. Opinions? God no. Preferences? You weren't even allowed to have a favorite kind of jam. If someone asked you your name, the correct response was probably, "As you wish, sir." There's something both tragic and impressive about this level of self-discipline, like a monk. But instead of meditating in the woods, you were polishing a brass doorknob until you could see your soul reflected in it, and wishing you couldn't. Butlers weren't just trained in etiquette. They were indoctrinated into a worldview, one that said, your worth comes from how well you hide your own existence. And maybe, just maybe, if you were perfect long enough, you might rise. You might become the senior butler, or the estate manager, or, if you truly ascended, be given a small room with your own wash basin. Luxury. Of course, this aspirational ladder was greased with exhaustion and rarely led anywhere but to more of the same. Now, if you were American-born, things were slightly different. The US, still obsessed with pretending it had no class system, preferred its butlers to be imported, or at least trained in the British style. That meant speaking with an accent you didn't have, referencing lords you'd never met, and perfecting the ability to say "certainly, madam" in a tone that suggested you'd rather be wrestling raccoons in a ditch. Which, honestly, might have paid better. Americans wanted old-world elegance without old-world nuance. So butlers had to be worldly, but not worldly enough to talk back. Cultured, but not cultured enough to question the wallpaper. Competent, but not memorable. Like an incredibly efficient ghost in a three-piece suit. Let's pause. Breathe that in. The smell of floor polish, boiled wool, and mild class resentment. And here's the kicker. You had to like it, or at least pretend to, because unlike factory workers or coal miners, you weren't allowed to complain. Complaining was for the unrefined. You were above that. Stoic, serene, dying inside. But with dignity. Let's not sugarcoat it. Training to be a butler was a form of spiritual exfoliation. It stripped you raw, polished your edges, and sent you out into the world to be trampled on by people who couldn't operate a teapot. And yet, many stuck with it. Why? Because it offered something rare. A twisted kind of status. You might have been a servant, but in the eyes of the staff you were elite. You ran the house. You knew the schedules. You managed the wine and the whispers. You had keys, multiple, and in a world built on doors you weren't allowed to enter. That mattered. There's also the quiet pride. The pride in precision, in knowing that if someone handed you a tangled ball of napkins, you could origami that mess into something fit for a king. The pride in keeping chaos at bay, in being the calm in someone else's storm, even if you were personally drowning. But here's the great irony of the Gilded Age butler. The more refined you became, the more you disappeared. You graduated from a world of calloused hands and cow pies into one of crystal goblets and whispered corrections, only to find yourself lonelier than ever, because nobody really sees a butler. They see what he provides. Comfort, stability, silence. He is not a man. He is a service. And to become that, from the muddy fields to the marbled halls, you had to give up more than sleep. You gave up yourself. So yes, from farm boy to fork whisperer, and the whisper never ends. The alarm clock hadn't been invented yet, but that was fine. You didn't need one. Your life was one long continuous alarm, rung by the cold stone floor beneath your feet, the sound of distant boots in the corridor, and that persistent, bone-deep ache that whispered, "Time to serve." You didn't wake up in the basement. You came back to life in it. Barely. This wasn't just any basement. This was the underbelly of wealth, a place where every creak of a floorboard above meant someone rich was stirring. And you were now behind. Already. The master hadn't even put on his embroidered slippers, and somehow you were already late. So you threw off the wall blanket that felt more like a decorative rug than something meant for human warmth, and swung your legs over the side of your too-short cot. The air was damp, as always somewhere between a wine cellar and a crypt, and the oil lamp flickered with the enthusiasm of a defeated spirit, much like you. But the day was calling, or rather the bells would be soon. And you needed to get ahead of them. First order of business. Shoes. Always the shoes. Not yours, of course. The master's. He had 36 pairs, some of which had never touched dirt, and each one needed to be buffed until you could see the crushed dreams of the working class reflected back in them. You didn't polish shoes, you worshipped them. The shine wasn't just for aesthetic, it was to prove that you still cared, or at least that you were terrified not to. Then came the fires. Fireplaces in every room, because the rich were cold in very specific places. They liked ambience. They liked the idea of warmth. They did not, however, appreciate soot, which meant you, the butler, or head footman, or glorified ash removal technician, had to clear the previous day's cinders, restack the wood, and light it all, without so much as a smoky whiff crossing the velvet drapes. Let's pause there. That's a lot before breakfast. And speaking of which, you didn't get breakfast. Not right away. First you made their breakfast. Tea, precisely steeped, eggs, but only soft-boiled and served in a cup that matched the saucer, that matched the tablecloth, that matched the general emotional tone of the household that day. Spoiler, it was usually tense with a hint of judgment. If you were lucky, and by lucky we mean momentarily ignored, you might sneak a heel of bread on your way back down to the basement. Cold, stale, eaten standing up in a hallway. But calories are calories, and your spine didn't arch itself. Now let's talk about the dreaded morning ritual, the gentleman's dressing. This was not throw on some pants and go. This was a theatrical production involving vests, cravats, suspenders, and more starch than the average potato harvest. You had to lay out the outfit, predict his mood, grey waistcoat if he was melancholic, something with brass buttons if he was feeling obnoxious, and assist him in dressing like a dignified lamppost. God forbid the shirt was the wrong one. God forbid the cufflinks didn't match the walking stick, and heaven help you if you handed him the wrong scent. Yes, there were scents, bottles of cologne arranged like soldiers, each one labelled for a specific occasion: dinner with investors, lunch with mistress, passive-aggressive confrontation with cousin. And there you were, dressing a man who probably couldn't spell laundry, trying not to breathe too loudly lest he notice you existed. After dressing came the orders. What he wanted done that day, sometimes detailed, sometimes vague to the point of psychological warfare. The drawing room seems uninspired. Handle it. Move the roses. I'm tired of looking at. The cat looks bored. And off you went, deciphering cryptic, rich person riddles while simultaneously managing the rest of the staff. Because, yes, you weren't just a servant. You were middle management with a migraine. You juggled schedules, mediated disputes between the upstairs maid and the scullery girl, and soothed the cook after the lady of the house dared to call her beaufort croûte merely adequate. Meanwhile, the house ticked forward like an overly complicated Swiss watch. Everything had to run on schedule. Breakfast by 8, drawing room refreshed by 9, silver inspected by 10, letters delivered, errands dispatched, dining service polished, all before anyone of actual importance even noticed the time. You were the gears beneath the glitter, and if one cog slipped, the whole charade cracked. Let's stop here, breathe that in. Take a long, slow inhale of linen starch, coal dust, and unprocessed resentment. Ah, Victorian aromatherapy. Now you might ask, when did you rest? Great question. Short answer, you didn't. Long answer, maybe after dinner, if the family retired early and didn't spontaneously decide to host a piano recital in the parlour for a baron who definitely wasn't invited. Then, maybe, you could sit down. Not lie down, just perch like a bat in a butler's suit. Always alert, always within earshot of a bell. Let's circle back to the basement, your sanctuary/cell. This is where you lived, and by lived, we mean existed between episodes of being needed. Your room was small, humble, damp enough to preserve meat. Furnished with a rickety bed, a chipped basin, and a mirror that never showed you looking awake. The wallpaper was mould, the ambiance unforgiving. But this room was yours, kind of. Until the master's cousin came to visit unexpectedly and needed a spare room. In which case, congratulations, you are now sleeping in the linen closet. Again. And still, you did it. You got up. Every day. You pulled yourself from that clammy cot and became the first heartbeat of the house. Before the clocks chimed, before the birds sang, before anyone above stairs remembered your name, if they ever had. Because someone had to. Someone had to ignite the engine of luxury. Someone had to make it look effortless. So you rose from the basement. Again. Not because you were appreciated, but because it was expected. And in the Gilded Age, that was enough. Let's talk about the uniform. That beautifully stitched prison of wool, starch, and soul compression. It didn't just sit on your body. It consumed it. It announced silently but firmly that you belonged to someone else. Not legally, perhaps, but spiritually and sartorially. The Gilded Age butler's uniform was many things. Precise, pristine, profoundly uncomfortable. It was part military regalia, part magician's costume, part straitjacket. There was no such thing as casual wear. There was only varying degrees of formal servitude. Morning coat, waistcoat, starched wing-collar shirt, cravat, gloves, and trousers with a crease so sharp it could sever friendships. The fabric? Wool, always wool. Summer? Still wool. Heatwave? More wool. Shirt clinging to your back like a desperate ex? Deal with it. You were expected to radiate cool, calm dignity while slowly poaching inside your own skin. And the gloves. Oh, the gloves. The thin, tight, and deliberately constricting, like a handshake from your childhood disappointment. You wore them to protect the silverware from your filthy human oils. Because God forbid the gravy boat smell like you. No, it had to smell like wealth and denial. Let's start from the bottom up. Shoes were polished to a mirror sheen, not by a cobbler, mind you, but by you. If your reflection in your toe cap didn't spark an existential crisis, it wasn't polished enough. You wore thin black socks, dress trousers tailored to brush just above your heel, and suspenders hidden beneath your waistcoat like shame under a smile. The waistcoat was snug, because form-fitting was professional, and breathing was optional. It had to button just right. No gaps, no bunching, no visible strain, even if your lungs disagreed. A bulge meant sloppiness. Sloppiness meant failure. Failure meant we'll find someone else who wants this job more, Jenkins. Above that, the shirt. White, of course. Always white. A white, so white it practically whistled when you walked past. If there was even a hint of tea stain, back down to the laundry it went. The collar was stiff, starched into a blade that hovered beneath your jawline. This was not a collar. This was a domestic guillotine. One wrong movement, and it felt like your neck was being punished for a crime it didn't commit. And then came the jacket, the morning coat or tailcoat, depending on the time of day and occasion. This garment defied physics. It had no stretch, no forgiveness. If you reached too far left, it yanked right. If you bent forward, it threatened to rupture. It was designed for standing still, the preferred hobby of every butler. Movement was tolerated. Motion was discouraged. Let's not forget the accessories. Cravat tied, perfectly. Never askew, never wrinkled. Pocket watch, gleaming. White gloves, immaculate. Hair parted with surgical precision. Face expressionless but alert. Posture, upright but not aggressive. You weren't auditioning for war, just subservience. And you put this entire ensemble on every single day. Butlers didn't dress. They armored. Each piece had a purpose, and that purpose was to suppress individuality. You weren't just a man in a suit. You were a walking brand. The brand was, I will die before I cause a scene. Your appearance told the world, I am trustworthy. I am silent. I am very, very tired. Let's reflect. What kind of job makes you this tense about your shoulders? The kind where standing in the wrong place could mean a demotion. Where a wrinkled jacket could cost you employment. Where existing in an unseemly fashion, like sweating, was viewed as a character flaw. Now imagine maintaining this image for 16 hours straight. No slouching, no loosening your collar, no removing your jacket, even while carrying a boiling tureen of soup through a crowded room of aristocrats who thought soup was an occasion for power moves. And you couldn't wince, you couldn't frown. If you burned your hand, you smiled through it. That's the butler way. Do you know what happens when you wear a mask for long enough? You forget it's a mask. The uniform, over time, stops being fabric. It becomes identity. People stop seeing the man and start seeing the outline of the suit. They speak around you, not to you. They make jokes in your presence, as if you weren't there, because in their minds, you aren't. You're furniture that occasionally blinks. And here's the brutal part. You begin to believe it too. You begin to assess yourself based on crease, posture, and whether the lady of the house sighed when you handed her a shawl. You iron your dignity along with your cuffs. You press your personality out with the pleats. You clip your dreams to your lapel and hope they don't fall off when you bow. The uniform enforces a kind of spiritual discipline. You become obsessed with being spotless, composed, silent, because the alternative is being replaced. And replacements were always waiting, hungrier, younger, with better cheekbones. Let's take a moment for the ritual itself, the act of getting dressed. Each morning, before the bells, before the teapots, before the day even started, you stood before your meager mirror and transformed from man to role, from name to title, from individual to institution. You brushed every lint, aligned every seam, buttoned every button like it was a pact with fate. And each time, you wondered, is this who I am now? Let's say the family is hosting a dinner party. You can't just wear the usual uniform. No, now we're in formal wear, white tie, tails, cummerbunds, shoes that feel like medieval torture devices. You must glide across polished floors without a squeak. You must bow without creasing. You must sweat invisibly. Now guests arrive. You greet them with the elegance of a duchess reincarnated in wool. You remove coats, announce names, and mentally record who brought the cheap champagne, so the lady of the house can judge them later. And as you do this, your uniform speaks for you. It says, "You are safe here. We are civilized. We are wealthy enough to own people without legally owning them." It's unsettling, really. You can't even lean against a wall. Wrinkles. Remember? So you hover, perfectly upright, like a sentient grandfather clock with opinions you'll never share. Meanwhile, the guests drink, flirt, gossip. Someone insults the Irish. Someone drops a canapé. You, the silent guardian of social order, swoop in to erase the evidence of humanity. Napkin, tray, nod. Gone. No eye contact. No sound. And when the last guest has stumbled out, misquoting Shakespeare and clutching someone else's muff, you begin the real work, cleaning up, still in uniform, because God forbid anyone catches you in shirt sleeves. That's how revolutions start. Let's shift tones, softly now. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when the uniform felt like armor, not a prison, but a shield. In those seconds you stood straighter. You carried the tray, not as a burden, but as a symbol. You were the keeper of the house, the conductor of its daily symphony, a man whose silence held everything together. But then the buttons pinched, and the collar scratched, and the gloves reminded you that your hands were not your own, and so you remembered, this wasn't armor, it was camouflage. And eventually you forget what you looked like underneath it all. If you've ever wondered what pure, unfiltered anxiety sounds like, it's not a scream or a crash. It's the ding of a brass bell in a Gilded Age mansion, a single chime, barely audible upstairs. But in the butler's hallway, it was thunder, polite thunder, with consequences. You see, bell pulls were the original surveillance system. Think of them as a 19th century version of Hey Siri, except instead of playing music or turning off your lights, it summoned an underpaid man in a tailcoat to bring you a lukewarm beverage, and he had about 14 seconds to do it before the second bell rang, the one that implied disappointment. Every room in a Gilded Age mansion had one: the drawing room, the morning room, the music room, the boudoir's closet, each pull attached to a string, that string connected to a wire, and that wire led through labyrinthine passages and around corners, more twisted than your employer's financial ethics, to the servants' hall. There, in the butler's command center, sat a long wooden board, mounted on little brass labels, each with the name of a room and a tiny hammer beside it. When a bell was pulled upstairs, the corresponding hammer would twitch, then strike a chime. A sound so deceptively gentle you'd think it were announcing tea, not existential dread. And the moment it rang, every head turned, because whoever moved slowest had to explain to the butler why Mrs. Rutherford's embroidery footstool wasn't properly adjusted. Now if you were the butler, you didn't run. That was for the footman. You walked, swiftly, elegantly, but never rushed. because rushing meant panic, and panic meant someone might realize you were human. The trick was to glide. Always glide. Even if the room on the bellboard said nursery and you knew that meant the twins had released the gerbil again. But let's back up a bit. The bell system didn't exist in a vacuum. It lived within the architectural nightmare that was the Victorian mansion. On the surface, these homes looked like opulent temples to taste and elegance. Underneath, they were domestic mazes, intentionally designed so that servants could appear and disappear like summoned ghosts. Servants' staircases were narrow, steep, and hidden. Always were constructed not for comfort, but for invisibility. You moved through the house like a well-trained roomer, felt, but never seen. There were even doors within doors, sometimes double doors designed specifically so that you could enter, clean the fireplace, and leave without ever disturbing the fragile ecosystem of morning tea and thinly veiled marital tension. So when that bell rang, you didn't just respond, you navigated, you dodged. You slithered through side doors, bypassed main corridors, and emerged silently, as though materialized by an ancient ritual involving awkward eye contact and endless bowing. The problem, of course, was that bells didn't ring one at a time. No, that would have been manageable. Bells rang in clusters, or waves, or full-scale acoustic attacks. At any moment the entire board could light up like a judgmental Christmas tree. Drawing room, music room, library, smoking room, panic. And God help you if you prioritized incorrectly. Answer the wrong bell first. You might offend the master's second cousin who will now refer to you in the third person for the next 6 weeks. Forget to answer the one marked conservatory. That's a missed opportunity to be scolded for not knowing how she likes her ferns dusted. Delay too long before arriving at the morning room. The lady of the house might assume you're dead, which she'll consider a mild inconvenience. Let's do a little thought experiment. It's Tuesday morning. The master of the house is pacing in the study, deciding which cravat says I respect the Board of Trade but not their opinions. He pulls the bell. Ding. You're halfway up the stairs, carrying a tray of smoked herring. Drawing room bell rings. Down the corridor, the breakfast parlor rings. Ding. Suddenly, horror, the upstairs maid drops a vase in the hallway, and now the library bell is ringing. Ding, ding. You have 4 bells, 2 hands, 1 butler brain. What do you do? Simple. You make a triage decision. Like a battlefield medic with a tea tray. You assign urgency based on personality, social standing, likelihood of public meltdown, and whether anyone's holding a guest hostage in the sunroom again. This is the invisible calculus of the butler. Every chime is a test. Every step is a potential firing squad. Every decision has the moral weight of a small tribunal. Now, let's talk about false alarms. Sometimes, guests would accidentally pull the bell, as though casually groping for velvet cords while rearranging themselves on a fainting couch was somehow natural. Other times, children, those tiny agents of chaos, would pull them just to see what would happen. What happened was, you showed up, silent, confused, slightly out of breath, met with giggles, or worse, a disinterested shrug. Occasionally, the bell would ring and no one would be there. A phantom pull. A glitch in the wire. Or, maybe, just maybe, the house remembering someone who used to ring it. Let that one settle for a sec. Of course, not all bell summons were petty. Sometimes, they were urgent. A guest had collapsed. The master had forgotten where he lived. The dog had bitten the postman again. And in those moments, the bell system wasn't just ornamental tyranny, it was a lifeline, a whisper for help. But mostly, it was tyranny. Let's not sugarcoat it. These bells were status made tangible. They allowed someone upstairs to interrupt your life at will. They were gentle reminders that you were never, ever off duty. Even in the dead of night, if that bell rang, you rang. Didn't matter if your body ached, or your dreams were just getting good. The cord had been pulled, and so were you. Now, there was one bell that lived in a category all its own, the front door bell. The big one, the announcement of arrival. When it rang, the household shifted. If it was early, it meant deliveries. Bread, milk, regret. If it rang in the afternoon, it was visitors. If it rang after dark, suspicion. Answering the front door was a delicate ballet. You had to open it just wide enough to greet, but not so wide that they saw into the house. Especially if the carpets hadn't been fluffed or the umbrella stand had been moved half an inch. You bowed. You welcomed. You judged them silently based on the quality of their boots. And then you decided whether they were guest material or kindly wait here while I fetch the appropriate level of disappointment. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Tap that subscribe like it's the dinner gong. And you're already 20 minutes late. Let's return to the bellboard. You may think it's just a tool, or relic, but for the butler, it was the heart monitor of the house. It told you where the tension was thickest, where the need was brewing, where the social catastrophe was about to bloom like a mouldy souffle. And at the end of the day, when the last bell had rung, when the last guest had left, when the last wine stain had been scrubbed from the parlor rug, you sat, you looked at the silent bellboard, and for a moment you felt peace. Until the next morning, when it all began again. Welcome to the butler's pantry, the smallest room in the house with the biggest mental breakdown potential. This wasn't a pantry in the modern sense. There were no late-night snack raids or quietly stolen biscuits. No, this was less pantry and more command center for an emotionally suppressed war. A sacred chamber where porcelain met paranoia and silver met seething quiet resentment. Let's set the scene. The butler's pantry was usually tucked somewhere between the kitchen and the dining room. Not for convenience, but so that the butler could exist close to chaos without ever truly being part of it. It was the Switzerland of servant spaces. Neutral territory. Perfectly polished, where everything had a place and every place had a price. And it was yours. All yours. Your domain. Your bunker. Your slightly damp sanctuary of order. And yet, you didn't live there. You survived there. The pantry contained everything important that no one noticed. The good silver, the fine china, the lead crystal glasses that cost more than your annual wages. These weren't just objects, they were holy relics, and your job was to guard them like a penitent monk with obsessive-compulsive tendencies and a mild sleep disorder. Each piece had its place. Each place had a rule. Forks went tines up. Not because it mattered, but because everything mattered. You didn't just store plates. You arranged them by event, by origin, by how angry the lady of the house got if they were used at the wrong time. The luncheon set had nothing to do with lunch, and everything to do with which aunt was visiting. And then there was the silver. Let's talk about the silver. Oh, the silver. There was more silver in a Gilded Age mansion than in most small banks. It wasn't enough to have silver. You had to have the right silver. Soup spoons, oyster forks, asparagus tongs, grape scissors. Yes, grape scissors, all lovingly polished, until your fingertips bled emotionless professionalism. You didn't just maintain it, you managed it. With charts, and drawers, and a borderline unhealthy relationship with a polishing cloth. Each night, after the guests had stumbled off to their overstuffed bedrooms, and the family had retired to judge each other in private, you returned here, to the pantry. You laid out the silver, you reviewed the glassware, you inspected every dish like a museum curator, fueled entirely by fear and a biscuit you stole from the scullery maid. If a single teaspoon was out of place, if one edge of a charger plate bore even a whisper of tarnish, that was it. That was your reputation, your standing, your right to exist above the kitchen staff. Gone. Over. Stripped like varnish from a sideboard. Let's reflect. This wasn't just cleaning. This was ritual. This was identity. But the pantry wasn't just about objects. It was also a place of planning. You kept the master guest list here. You tracked who liked which wine, who had a dairy allergy they refused to admit, and who couldn't stand being seated near Cousin Alfred since that unfortunate fox hunting incident. You knew which decanter to use for which sherry, and which one had the microscopic crack that only you could see. You could fold napkins into swans, pyramids, or, if you were feeling particularly expressive, quiet existential screams. You knew the layout of the table before it existed. You saw the matrix, only it was made of cutlery and fragile egos. And yet, despite all this precision, the butler's pantry was not safe. It was always close to the fire, sometimes. Literally. One wall away from the kitchen, where pans clanged, tempers flared, and the cook held dominion like a flour-dusted dictator. You were near enough to hear everything, but not to intervene. Unless something exploded, then it was your job to explain it with calm dignity and a possibly fabricated excuse. But it wasn't just the kitchen you were close to. It was the dining room, the battlefield, and you were the frontline medic. The butler's pantry had a discreet door, the service entrance as if you were a polite burglar, through which you delivered and retrieved dishes like a ghost with perfect posture. You didn't walk through it, you materialized. No sound, no drama, just present. Let's imagine a scene. It's Thursday night, formal dinner, 12 guests, 1 vegetarian, 1 passive-aggressive baroness, 2 people recently divorced but seated next to each other because someone didn't know. The soup course is late. The cook is screaming something about underboiled turnips. You are standing in your pantry breathing, slowly, 1 hand on the brandy decanter, 1 eye on the bell. The drawing room chimes. Ding. And you go. You don't panic. You straighten your jacket, adjust your cuff, smooth your face into the look that says nothing is on fire, and you step out. Because that's what the butler's pantry is. A threshold between chaos and calm, between reality and performance. It's also where the butler ate. Technically, you didn't have a dining table. You had a stool. A small wooden stool next to a tiny folding table, just wide enough for a plate. If you were lucky, and if no one was watching, you'd sneak a few mouthfuls of cold beef and congealed gravy between courses, but never too much. A full stomach was a liability. It made you sluggish, indulgent, human. We can't have that. And yet, for all its discomforts, the pantry offered one gift: solitude. It was the one room in the house where you could be alone. Just you and your reflections in 100 spoons. Sometimes you even took off your gloves. Not both, just one. Just enough to remember you had skin. Let that sink in. The act of removing a glove became a minor rebellion. Let's turn to the tools. Within these narrow walls lived all the implements of presentation. The cloths, the trays, the special brushes for cleaning decanter stoppers, the antique lemon zester that hadn't worked since 1862, but still had to be displayed in the summer, the notebook where you logged dinner menus going back 5 years, just in case someone asked, "Didn't we serve this patty in 9?" And heaven help you if you repeated a course. The pantry also had the list, the master list, the sacred inventory of inventory. When guests borrowed silverware for a picnic, because that was a thing, you logged. When the lady of the house requested the shellfish set, which turned out to be missing 3 shrimp forks and 1 sense of proportion, you logged it. And then anything went missing, you found it. You always found it. Even if it meant questioning the gardener, inspecting the laundry baskets, and checking the pond. Yes, the pond. Long story. Still, you kept the peace. Because the butler's pantry wasn't just a place. It was a state of mind. You existed in that quiet space between servitude and sovereignty. You had keys. Remember, access, knowledge, control, and in a house that revolved around vanity and theatre, you tucked in your little room, polishing a decanter with a cloth older than democracy, with a director, the orchestra conductor, the heartbeat. The butler's pantry didn't ask for glory, it asked for perfection. And in return, it offered what exactly? Not praise, not comfort, not sleep, but maybe, just maybe, a moment at the end of the night, when the dishes were done, the silver was stacked, and the candles in the dining room gutted out. When you sat alone in your pantry, with a cup of tea, you made yourself, and breathed. And in that quiet, with the hum of the mansion above, and the clink of your teaspoon below, you felt something rare. You felt like yourself again, even if only for a moment. Dinner. A simple word, a comforting concept. For most people, it conjures images of warm bread, idle conversation, and maybe a candle or two. But in a Gilded Age mansion, dinner meant something entirely different. It meant war, ritual, performance. It meant that every piece of cutlery had to be placed with the precision of a military operation. And you, dear butler, were the general, a general who was never allowed to speak, sit, or display any signs of being alive. Let's set the table, both literally and figuratively. Dinner parties during the Gilded Age weren't just social events. They were high-stakes productions, designed to impress, intimidate, and reaffirm everyone's place on the increasingly unstable ladder of late 19th century society. Guests weren't invited because they were loved. They were summoned to serve as props in a grand opera of conspicuous consumption. The goal wasn't to enjoy yourself. The goal was to be seen enjoying something that cost more than your butler's annual salary. And who made it all happen? You did. The butler. Hours before the guests arrived, the house transformed. Tables were expanded with secret leaves hidden in shadowy closets. Chairs were rearranged until they looked casually effortless, but obeyed a deeply neurotic logic. Flowers were placed in vases, so expensive they had their own backstories. Each petal had to evoke elegance without outshining the hostess, who by this point was already on her third brandy and screaming about asparagus spoons. You handled the silver, you set the place cards, you oversaw the wine decanting. You calibrated candle heights, like you were preparing a ritual to summon restraint itself. Everything had to be perfect, and by perfect, we mean performative. The centerpieces, sculptures of fruit, real fruit, wax fruit, sometimes even crystal fruit, the kind no one ate but everyone was supposed to admire. The napkins, folded into shapes so complex they could qualify as origami PhDs. The soup spoons had to curve exactly to the right, not kind of to the right. Exactly. Why? Because someone once attended a royal banquet in Vienna and wouldn't shut up about it. As guests arrived, you stood by the door, silent, immovable, and professionally dead inside. You announced names. You took coats. You remembered every insult they'd ever casually tossed your way and smiled through it. Because tonight wasn't about you. It was about spectacle. Once seated, the madness began. Let's walk through a typical multi-course Gilded Age dinner party. First course, oysters, served raw, with lemon wedges so artfully arranged they looked like a citrus conspiracy. You brought the tray out like it was a newborn child. You did not drop it. You did not rush. You did not exist. Next up, consommé. A broth so clear it had to pass as spiritual, served in shallow bowls that were heated beforehand. Because lukewarm soup could destroy reputations, you made sure each guest received theirs at the exact same time, because if one guest started sipping before another, society collapsed. Then fish, trout, turbot, occasionally something exotic that the host mispronounced but insisted on serving because it sounded French, served with a fish knife, not to be confused with the butter knife which was also present, dangerously close, ready to ruin everything if handled improperly. After fish came an entree, not the main course mind you. This was pre-entree. Possibly quail, possibly stuffed tongue, possibly something you weren't allowed to ask questions about. You delivered it with flair. Quiet flair, the kind that said, yes, this dish smells like damp velvet, but I am still dignified. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Press that subscribe like it's the cloche, and you're about to reveal a roasted pheasant. Main course. Finally, usually roast beef, game bird, or a lavish dish you knew would stain the linens. You served it with vegetables that had been boiled into oblivion, and sauces that smelled like aristocratic desperation. You moved quickly but gracefully. You watched guests jab at the food with mild confusion. You smiled when they complimented your cook's touch, knowing full well the cook hadn't slept in 36 hours, and was 2 spoons away from smashing a tureen over someone's head. After the main course, there was a palate cleanser. Sorbet, often in bizarre flavors like celery or champagne ice. You served it in delicate glasses, arranged like a fragile army. You listened as guests pretended to enjoy it, because real sophistication meant tolerating absurdity, then cheese, then fruit, then dessert, then port, then coffee, then blessedly the end. Except it wasn't, because after the meal came the post-dinner movements. The men retired to the smoking room. The women floated to the drawing room, where they pretended to like each other while playing parlor games, and trying not to discuss how bored they were. And you? You floated between them, offering refills, clearing glasses, and pretending not to hear gossip that would make your toes curl. You knew who was sleeping with whom, who was financially insolvent, who had tried to buy a title from a very suspicious Belgian man. You knew it all. But you said nothing, always nothing. Let's pause. Just breathe. In through the nose, out through the judgment. This was your reality. Dinner parties were marathons of manners, pageants of pretense. You performed your role with surgical precision, while secretly tracking every guest's wine intake, conversational volume, and proximity to the family silver. You had to anticipate disasters before they occurred. A guest too drunk? Nudge the footman. A souffle collapsing. Whisper to the cook. An argument brewing between rival cousins. adjust the seating plan under the guise of checking the salt spoons. You were not a servant. You were a social referee, a battlefield medic for ego wounds, but you couldn't show it. You couldn't roll your eyes. You couldn't let the stress show on your face. You couldn't breathe too loudly if someone was monologuing about their new sapphire-encrusted lorgnette. And heaven help you if anything was out of place. A knife slightly crooked? Scandal. A wine glass with a smudge. Outrage. A delay in coffee service. The end of civilization. Because these weren't just dinners. These were stages for the insecure to act out the fantasies of nobility. These were ceremonies of power. The power to summon people, to be served, to be admired. And you, the butler, were the one pulling the invisible strings to make it all happen. And when it was finally over, when the guests had left, trailing cologne and half-baked compliments, when the last of the candles had guttered, and the last of the plates had been returned to their sacred drawer, you removed your gloves. Slowly, gently, like peeling off the day itself. You looked around the dining room, still echoing with laughter that wasn't real. And you exhaled, because you'd done it. You'd survived another night at the theatre, and tomorrow there would be another show. Let's talk about power. Not the kind that builds empires or funds railroads, but the kind that brews quietly in teacups and lingers behind closed doors. The power of knowing things. In the Gilded Age, everyone upstairs wanted influence. Everyone downstairs wanted to avoid being noticed. And in the middle stood the butler, the silent node of an extremely judgmental human internet. Yes, the gossip pipeline. Unofficial, unacknowledged, utterly indispensable. And, at the center of it all, you, the butler. Now, to be clear, a proper butler would never admit to gossip. Certainly not. The very idea, you didn't speak of things, you simply retained them. Like a very polite hard drive with eyebrows. But make no mistake, you knew everything. Let's begin at the top. Quite literally, the family. Their secrets weren't just skeletons in closets. They were live wires, sparking constantly just behind the velvet curtains. Affairs, addictions, financial disasters. Cousins who weren't really cousins. You saw it all. You heard it all. You cleaned up after it all. Take the master of the house, for example. Publicly dignified, privately unraveling. You've stood outside his study door while he screamed into his brandy. You've picked up letters he carelessly dropped, full of debts, demands, and barely legal property acquisitions in South America. You've escorted his secretaries out the back door more times than you can count. And the lady of the house, impeccably dressed, razor-tongued, generous with compliments that were actually insults. She had a rotating staff of personal maids, not because they were incompetent, but because they knew too much. You, however, remained because you knew how to listen while appearing not to. Because you could watch an emotional breakdown unfold over asparagus and say nothing but, "Would Madam care for more wine?" Then there were the children. Terrifying. Entitled. Hilariously unaware of their surroundings. They snuck liquor, lost money, and once attempted to host a séance in the conservatory. You made sure the candles didn't burn the drapes, and that no one mentioned the footman who mysteriously disappeared after. And yet, you didn't repeat any of it. Well, not publicly. Now, within the servant ranks, it was a different story. Below stairs, gossip was currency. Not traded like gold, more like contraband. Carefully passed, whispered, discreet. The kitchen staff always knew first. They had ears in the dining room, and hands on the dishes. The scullery maid heard every fight. The footman watched every exit. The upstairs maids leaned the aftermath, both literal and metaphorical. But it was you who assembled the puzzle. You who knew how it all connected. You weren't just the butler, you were the archive. You knew which guest snuck cigars into the nursery, which aunt was actually a spinster widow hiding from scandal, which visiting nobleman was not noble, and certainly not a man anyone should trust around the wine cellar. Your pantry became a hub, not just for cutlery, but for quiet revelations. Let's walk through a day in the life of butler gossip management. Morning. You receive a letter addressed to the master in handwriting you recognize from that weekend in Brighton. You place it silently on his desk. You adjust the position slightly so the maid doesn't see the seal. Midday, the lady of the house calls for tea in the drawing room. You overhear her discussing the incident at Lady Hargrave's ball. You make a note. The maid later confirms that Lady Hargrave fell into the punch bowl. Again, Evening, the footman mentions in passing that one of the guests smelled distinctly like gin and regret. You subtly double-check which guest has a reputation for mixing laudanum with his sherry, just in case. You store these details, quietly, carefully, not for entertainment, for protection, because knowledge was your only real power. You see, being a butler wasn't just about service, it was about survival, and survival depended on knowing when to act and when to disappear, on being able to prevent a scandal before it happened, or redirect blame if it already had. Sometimes, this meant intercepting letters. Sometimes it meant quietly removing items from guest rooms before the morning. Sometimes, and this was delicate, it meant suggesting that a certain visitor might not be the best company for young Master Charles, whose reputation was already hanging by a thread. Let's pause. Breathe that in. This wasn't meddling, this was stewardship. You were the keeper of the household's dignity, or what remained of it. Still, it wasn't without its ethical tightropes. There were moments you regretted staying silent, the bruises you noticed on a maid's wrist, the screaming you heard through the library door, the cook who drank to forget, and the guest who lingered too long in the corridor after dark. You couldn't act on everything, not in a system built on silence. But sometimes you could shift the winds, reassign a maid, lock a door, lose a bottle, and that was its own kind of resistance. Now let's talk about upstairs gossip. Not theirs, about them, because the guests gossiped too, relentlessly. Dinner conversation wasn't about food, it was about who had fallen, who had risen, who had married beneath them, and who had been seen in the wrong carriage, with the wrong person on the wrong side of the park. You stood behind them, refilling glasses, listened. You learned how to interpret coded insults and half-compliments. She's quite modern in her views, isn't she? Translation: she's a menace. He's very involved in local affairs. Translation: he's bankrupt. Such a free spirit. Translation: she slept with everyone and might be French. Every whisper was a weapon. Every smile was loaded. And you, the butler, held all their ammunition. But you never used it, at least not openly, because that would be breaking the code. The ancient, unspoken rule that the butler knows everything and says nothing. It wasn't just about professionalism, it was about identity. To speak was to break the spell. To gossip aloud was to join the fray, to become one of them. And you weren't. You were something else entirely. A witness. An archivist. A ghost. Let's reflect. What does it mean to live a life surrounded by secrets? To carry them, day after day, without ever offloading the weight. To be invisible, yet omnipresent. The one person in the house who truly knew everyone, but was known by no one. It means that sometimes, the silence wasn't discipline. It was loneliness. It means that the pantry felt quieter not just because it was small, but because no one ever asked how you were. You were the keeper of stories, and no one ever asked for yours. Sunday, the so-called day of rest. The gentle pause between Saturdays of social absurdity and Mondays of aristocratic micromanagement. A day that, on paper, promised serenity, reflection, and perhaps, if the gods of linen and labour aligned, a moment to sit down without consequence. But here's the problem: paper lies. And so did Sunday. For the Gilded Age butler, Sunday was not a day off. It was a day off limits. A beautifully dressed deception. A performance of peace that required even more backstage work than the main show. If Monday through Saturday were relentless, Sunday was simply more of the same, just in quieter shoes. Let's start with the myth. It began with the lie that the family doesn't require full service on Sundays. What this meant in practice was that full service would still be expected, just not acknowledged. So while the lady of the house bragged to guests that her staff enjoyed a proper Christian rest, you were down in the cellar removing mold from the silver salt spoons because someone decided to serve anchovies in them again. Technically, Sunday mornings started slower, which only meant the to-do list began later and came with a pre-loaded time crunch. You still rose early, not because anyone told you to, but because Sunday or not, the fires wouldn't light themselves, the breakfast trays wouldn't levitate, and the lady's prized spaniel still required its 6,000 AM chicken liver omelette. Then came church. Oh, church. For the family, it meant dressing in their pious best, climbing into the carriage, and spending 45 minutes pretending not to judge the other pews. For you, it meant shining shoes to a mirror gleam, buttoning every button with sacramental precision, and making sure the prayer books were embossed and unwrinkled. After all, nothing says divine humility like matching gold leaf Bibles. But you weren't going to church. Not really. You were escorting them, waiting outside in the cold like a very polite statue. Or, if you were fortunate, sitting on the back pew with the rest of the staff, pretending to pray while calculating whether you had time to finish polishing the guest room bed knobs before lunch. Church ended. The family returned. The bell rang, and suddenly Sunday was indistinguishable from every other day, because of the guests. There were always guests. You'd think Sunday would be off limits to social intrusion, but in the Gilded Age, there was no such boundary. Visitors appeared like recurring nightmares. Some were invited, others simply dropped by, which was code for we had nothing better to do, and heard you served decent Madeira. The light Sunday luncheon quickly mutated into a full spread, cold roast beef, deviled eggs, cucumber sandwiches, sponge cake, aspic molds, always aspic. You were expected to present it all like it had just casually assembled itself from divine providence. You supervised the footmen, you aligned the dishes. You made sure the water glasses didn't touch the tablecloth in that way, all while the family claimed to be keeping it simple today. Let's talk about wardrobe, shall we? You still had to be in full uniform. No corners cut, no relaxing of standards. Even if the master was in his Sunday waistcoat, the one with slightly fewer buttons, you were still bound by starch and shadow. You wore your wool suit in summer and your winter gloves in spring, because Sunday might be a day of rest, but it was never a day of deviation. By mid-afternoon, if the family didn't plan an outing, a garden walk, a carriage ride, a tragic attempt at croquet, they often retired to the drawing room. This sounded like a reprieve, but it wasn't. It meant coffee service. It meant cakes. It meant the piano had to be dusted again, because someone insisted on playing a duet with their cousin. And you were expected to glide between the rooms like a morally upright cloud, refilling teacups and retrieving handkerchiefs with Victorian-level delicacy. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Subscribe like it's a holy obligation, and you're behind on your penance. Back in the servants' quarters, Sunday was no less absurd. If the family was out, that was your one shot, your golden moment to catch up on the kind of tasks that didn't require buttoned cuffs or careful bowing: cleaning the pantry shelves, organizing the wine cellar, relabeling the drawer that held the antique napkin rings, shaped like aquatic animals no one liked, but everyone insisted on using for Lent. You might have been told Sunday was a half day. Sure, half the day to do double the work, because you were off duty in the same way a candle is off when it's still smouldering. Every moment you weren't actively polishing was spent preparing to polish. You couldn't wander far, you couldn't nap, you couldn't change clothes. There was always the possibility of a bell, a visitor, a misplaced bonnet, a family crisis involving an accidentally scorched cravat. Let's pause. Reflect. You weren't just under pressure, you were pressure, distilled into human form, standing quietly near a console table, pretending not to hear the argument erupting between father and son over whether dinner jackets were vulgar. Dinner on Sundays was simpler, which meant it required a minimum of 5 courses instead of 10. The menus were slightly lighter. The expectations, just as heavy. The family liked to pretend this meal was casual, which meant they could be even more performatively formal about it. If anything, you had to work harder to make it look effortless. Effortless was expensive. After dinner came the goodnight rituals. The master expected his evening whiskey, poured in a glass that was not the usual weekday tumbler, but the rounded cut crystal he favoured for Sundays. The lady expected the fire turned down just so, her dog's paws cleaned from its walk, and the latest copy of the Illustrated London News placed next to her embroidery. All things you did. Silently. Invisibly. And if everything went according to plan, then came your moment. At around 10:15 p.m. you might retreat to the pantry, sit for exactly 12 minutes, remove one glove, sip the weakest cup of tea imaginable, and breathe. But even then, it wasn't over, because Sunday was also the planning day. You had to prepare the upcoming week's schedules, review the inventories, note who was expected for dinner on Tuesday, and who was arriving from Paris on Friday. You had to remind the footman to polish the candelabras, confirm that the linen order had arrived, check that the dog's blanket had been washed, and finally note whether the cook had once again misplaced the antique egg server. Only then, perhaps close to midnight, did Sunday end. And Monday began. So no, Sundays were not peaceful. They were an elaborate farce. A high-wire act of pretending to rest while performing twice as much. They were theatre, and the butler, the exhausted stagehand holding up the scenery. But here's the irony. Despite it all, the exhaustion, the absurdity, the performance, Sundays had their moments, the flicker of candlelight on polished glass. The sound of laughter, however, forced. The moment a child, confused and half asleep, mistook you for someone kind. You remembered those moments. You held on to them. Because while Sundays were a lie, sometimes they told you the truth about everything else. Let's begin with the smile. That tiny, mechanical curve of the lips. The one that said, "Yes, of course, I'll refill the brandy," while internally screaming, "I've been on my feet for 14 hours and would rather be swallowed by the carpet." That smile wasn't just part of the uniform. It was the uniform. You wore it like your gloves, tight, polished, and entirely unnecessary if humans were treated like humans. Because in the Gilded Age, the butler's smile was both armor and muzzle, a facial expression that could diffuse tempers, mask rage, and politely smother any trace of independent thought. It wasn't joy, it wasn't friendliness, it was emotional taxidermy. You posed it, stuffed it, maintained it, and eventually you forgot how to take it off. To understand the butler's smile, you first have to understand what it was protecting, the human beneath, the one who had opinions, dreams, maybe even a sense of humor, but who had learned very quickly that personality was a liability in a profession that required perfect emotional weather. You couldn't be happy exactly. That would seem suspicious. Giddy butlers were rarely trusted, but you couldn't be stoic either. That might read as distant, cold, or worse, uncooperative. The ideal was somewhere between pleasant and invisible, a constant low hum of agreeable nothingness, a human beige. Let's take a look at a real-life moment. A guest knocks over a glass of claret. Not just any glass. The antique crystal set from Lady Rothschild's wedding china. There's a pause, a gasp. And then, everyone looks at you. This is your moment. You glide in. Silent. Smile on. You kneel, blot, remove, replace. You say nothing of the stain. You make the guest feel that they are the victim of gravity's betrayal. And all the while, you smile, because you are not allowed to express the correct emotional response, which is something along the lines of, "You absolute disaster of a man-child. I hope your cufflinks tarnish." Let that sink in. Because that's a daily occurrence. A test of restraint disguised as hospitality. The smile, of course, wasn't just for guests. It was for the family. When the lady of the house mispronounced hors d'oeuvre for the 17th time, you smiled. When the master asked you to explain, again, how to fold a pocket square, despite having a valet, you smiled. When a child referred to you as the hallway man, you smiled. And, behind it, nothing. Because showing anything behind that smile was considered unprofessional. This wasn't new. This was conditioning. Years of training, years of learning that a neutral face wasn't enough. It had to be welcoming, warm, but never too warm. That was the art, the performance. And performances, as we know, are exhausting. Now let's go deeper. There were moments, late at night, standing alone in the butler's pantry, when you caught your reflection in the polished silver, and it smiled back, automatically, like a ghost of yourself. Because you smiled so often, your face no longer asked permission. It just assumed, even when you were sad, even when you were angry, even when you weren't there anymore. Because the butler's smile wasn't just for others. It was a line of defense against your own feelings, a way of keeping things tidy inside. Polished, controlled. After all, if your face never cracked, maybe the rest of you wouldn't either. But it wasn't sustainable. Sometimes, things slipped. A tremor in the corner of your mouth, a sigh disguised as a cough, a delayed nod. And suddenly, you were off. Not fired off, not yet, but watched. Because a butler's emotional state was considered contagious. If you looked weary, the house looked poorly managed. If you looked frustrated, it meant the family wasn't being sufficiently adored. If you looked anything other than content, the illusion cracked. And Gilded Age homes were built entirely on illusion. Still, you maintained it. You smiled when you were sick. smiled when you were grieving, smiled when the world tilted on its axis, because the master's second wife had opinions about the upholstery and his third wife was already on the guest list for Sunday lunch. You smiled through family meltdowns, through weddings that turned into lawsuits, through Christmases so tense the mistletoe tried to escape. You were the constant, the professional, the mask that reassured everyone else that things were fine, even when the drawing room was one slightly scorched syllable away from emotional arson. Let's pause, just for a moment. Breathe. What does that kind of repression do to a person? What happens to feelings that are never acknowledged, let alone expressed? They don't go away, they simmer, quietly, like a kettle that never whistles, because the butler is expected to listen for steam. There were small rebellions, invisible ones. You polished silver, with slightly more vigor. You closed doors a little faster than necessary. You gave the slightly chipped plate to the cousin who called you boy, even though you were 45 and had seen war. Tiny acts. Harmless but sacred. But mostly, you smiled. You smiled when your back ached. Smiled when the bell rang for the third time in 4 minutes. Smiled when the guest asked if you knew your letters. You smiled because it was your job. But also because it was your shield. Because without it, they'd see the real you. And the real you was tired. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Smile your way to that subscribe button before the master notices your posture drooped. Let's shift perspective. Gentle. The smile wasn't always fake. Sometimes. It was for you. A child said thank you. A guest complimented the table settings. Sincerely. The cook saved you a slice of pie. The dog fell asleep with its head on your foot. Moments like that? The smile was real. Brief, but real. Because being a butler wasn't just about repression. It was about pride. Pride in perfection. Pride in discretion. Pride in knowing that you held everything together with a steady hand and a quiet face. So yes, the butler's smile was a study in emotional repression. But it was also a work of art, a performance, a legacy, and sometimes, even a form of grace. The silver spoon clinks too loudly. The guest glances over. The master raises an eyebrow. Congratulations, your entire career might now hinge on whether that spoon was meant to clink. In the sacred ballet of Gilded Age service, perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded, and mistakes were the equivalent of high treason committed in tails and polished shoes. Let's be clear, the butler's job was to be invisible and flawless, a charming paradox engineered by people who had never folded their own socks. One wrong name, one slightly misaligned dinner knife, or one unfortunate sneeze during a toast, and boom, you weren't the trusted head of staff anymore. You were that butler, the one who ruined everything. Now imagine doing all that under candlelight, in wool, while managing 30 moving parts, none of which were allowed to touch or acknowledge one another, including your own soul. Let's dive into the Hall of Shame. Actual crimes against the social fabric included addressing Lady Worthing before Lady Fenchurch, pouring burgundy in a claret glass, using the wrong spoon for consommé, the horror, tripping, even slightly on carpet you just vacuumed, and of course, the gravest sin, speaking without being spoken to. One former butler, dismissed from a Boston estate in 1892, dared to utter good afternoon to a guest while passing in the corridor. That was it. Fired. Apparently the guest wasn't in the mood for unprovoked pleasantries. Can you imagine? How dare he greet me in my own home? The indignity. Butlers were expected to have the omniscience of a clairvoyant and the dexterity of a surgeon, with carpal tunnel. Yet, mistakes were inevitable. It was just math. One human, pal 18-hour shifts, 600 social landmines. Something will explode eventually. And when it did, there was no forgiveness, just replacement. Let's zoom in on a moment. The soup is served. It's lukewarm. The blame, not the kitchen. You, even though you didn't cook it. Even though you don't control the laws of thermodynamics, you're the messenger. And in a Gilded Age household, the messenger gets metaphorically, and sometimes literally, shot. You apologize. You bow. You endure a speech about standards. Then you smile, yes again, and retreat to find hotter soup, while also wondering if it's time to finally fake your own death and flee to Canada. Of course, not all mistakes were accidents. Sometimes they were calculated risks, like the time the wine cellar mysteriously ran out of the port the master preferred, which just so happened to get the footman drunk and violent. every time it was served. Or when the guest who groped the maid got a mysteriously icy bath and a bed short-sheeted with military precision. Mistakes? Maybe, but let's call them poetic justice with lace trim. Still, most mistakes were honest and costly. One unfortunate butler in Newport was fired after yawning during a 12-course dinner, not even loudly, just visibly. The lady of the house said it shattered the mood, as if the mood hadn't already been destroyed by her third attempt at French. Let that sink in. Fired for yawning after working 18 hours straight. Now imagine living with that kind of pressure. Every step, every movement, every syllable was a potential career-ending landmine, and yet you were still expected to perform flawlessly while exuding calm competence and silent enthusiasm, like an AI assistant in a bow tie, but one that could cry and develop sciatica. Mistakes also weren't confined to the dinner table. There were etiquette mistakes, emotional mistakes, spatial mistakes, like standing too close to a guest, or standing too far from a guest, or forgetting that Lady Spencer wanted her tea with lemon on Mondays, but milk on Thursdays for reasons known only to her and the ghost of Queen Victoria. Worse still were the mistakes that weren't even your own, but you bore the brunt anyway. The cook burns the roast. You served it. Your fault. The scullery maid drops a dish. You handed it to her. The family dog dies mysteriously after licking a mysterious powder labeled decorative moth deterrent. Somehow your fault. And if you think apologies were enough, think again. Some mistakes were career-ending. No reference, no pension, just your walking stick, a bow, and the sharp taste of shame. One error, and your name would become a cautionary tale passed between households like a ghost story. Remember Charles? Yes, the one who spilled wine on the Duchess's lap. Tragic. He's in Philadelphia now. Or jail. So why did they stay? Why endure a life where a single cough could cost you everything? Because beneath the threat of error was a deeper fear, being disposable. Mistakes didn't just threaten your job, they reminded you that, in the grand hierarchy of Gilded Age importance, you ranked somewhere between the parlor curtains and the ornamental goldfish. And yet, you persevered. You adapted. You learned to predict needs before they existed, sense moods before they were expressed, and correct errors before they became visible. You became not just a butler but a sixth sense in a waistcoat, and when the inevitable mistake did happen, you bowed, you apologized, you moved on. If you were lucky. Because even in a world where perfection was the expectation, survival was the true skill. You might think that a life of fetching slippers, balancing trays and pretending you don't exist, would create a deep camaraderie among servants. That maybe, just maybe, shared suffering would unite them like a well-oiled domestic army. Think again. Because even in the underworld of service, there was a hierarchy, a pecking order, a glorious pyramid of shared misery, and someone was always getting pecked. Let's break it down. At the top stood the butler, the crownless king of the downstairs domain. He was the only servant allowed to speak with a slight air of superiority, the only one with a proper room to himself, and the only one permitted to touch the silverware without being screamed at by the housekeeper. A position of dignity? Perhaps, but also one of immense pressure and constant surveillance. Being the butler was like being the CEO of a company that made nothing but folded napkins and passive aggression. Beneath him, the under-butler. His job was basically do what the butler does, but silently and with more polish. He was the butler's shadow, understudy, and sometimes emotional punching bag. If the butler failed, the under-butler caught the shrapnel. Then came the footmen, the dashing poster boys of service, chosen for height, posture, and whether they could wear livery without looking like a decorative lamppost. Their duties included opening doors, serving dishes, and providing subtle eye candy for bored duchess. They were the butler's go-to squad, and they knew it. Hence the internal footman hierarchy. First footman, second footman, third footman, like a weird boy band where everyone had calluses and PTSD. Now let's talk housemaids. Not technically under the butler's command. That was the domain of the terrifying, all-seeing housekeeper, but still part of the same layered misery lasagna. Housemaids had their own strata: head housemaid, parlourmaid, chambermaid, and the poor scullery maid, who basically lived in a fog of steam, shame, and leftover onion water. And yet, despite the shared dust inhalation and common enemy spoiled aristocrats, classism ran deep. The butler would never fraternize with a scullery maid. A first footman wouldn't dare eat with a boot boy. Everyone had their place. Everyone knew it. And heaven forbid you forgot yours. Consider the dining arrangements. Upstairs, the family ate from gold-rimmed plates under chandeliers. Downstairs, also rigidly hierarchical, the butler sat at the head of the servants' table, carving meat like a monarch of mops. The under-butler sat beside him, followed by the footman, the cooks, and way at the end, next to the door and possible fire hazard, the maids and junior staff. The scullery maid often didn't sit at all. She hovered, like a ghost, no one wanted to see, but everyone relied on. There were even separate staircases, the main stairs for the family, the staff stairs for those who could carry a tray while dodging insults. And within that, certain ranks weren't even allowed to use certain landings. Some butlers could walk through the main hallway, but only diagonally, and only if they made eye contact with no more than one candelabra. Let's be honest. The whole system was a masterclass in micro-distinctions. A footman might take pride in his livery, but resent the butler's velvet collar. A housemaid might dream of being a parlour maid, just for the privilege of arranging cushions instead of cleaning chamber pots. And yet, everyone judged. Everyone. The butler rolled his eyes at the cook's temper. The cook sneered at the footman's ego. The footman mocked the maid's clogs. The maid cursed the under-butler's clumsiness. And all of them, secretly loathed the valet and the lady's maid, who thought they were better than the rest, just because they got to travel and touch expensive undergarments. Let that settle in. Even the miserable found ways to stratify their suffering. This was no accident. It was engineered. The great genius of the Gilded Age elite was this. By encouraging division below stairs, they prevented rebellion. Who had time to organize for better wages or working conditions when they were too busy judging how Henry II footman polished the decanter with the wrong wrist motion? And don't even get us started on titles. You weren't just a maid, you were first upper housemaid of the East Wing, or senior under-butler for beverage presentation. It was corporate bureaucracy before corporate bureaucracy existed. All of this created a strange world where status meant everything and nothing. A butler had power over other servants, but none over his employer. A footman might feel superior to a scullery maid, right up until he got demoted for improperly aligning the asparagus tongs. And yet, the hierarchy provided one thing: structure. In a chaotic, dehumanizing job, it gave people a sense of place, even if that place was beneath 7 other people and a decorative fern. It also gave birth to rituals. The daily polishing of boots in order of rank, the precise rotation of serving duties, the unspoken rules about who could speak first, sit first, or breathe slightly louder at dinner, all enforced. All remembered, all insane. But perhaps the most tragic irony: even if you climbed the ladder, made it to butler or head housekeeper, you were still, at the end of the day, a servant. Your victories were silent, your triumphs invisible, your legacy a particularly gleaming dessert fork arrangement, and a reference letter written by someone who couldn't remember your last name, because in the Gilded Age, everyone knew their place. And for butlers, that place was between respect and erasure, at the top of the servant pile, but always under someone's boot. Ah yes, the clash of the titans, or more accurately, the passive-aggressive grudge match between 2 men trained never to raise their voices. On one side, the British butler, a marble statue in a waistcoat, forged in the cold fires of aristocratic detachment. On the other, the American butler, an imported prototype tasked with being both charming and invisible. A delightful paradox, like a smiling ghost who also folds napkins with military precision. Let's be clear, the British butler was the gold standard, the tuxedoed Obi-Wan of domestic hierarchy. His entire life was a masterclass in self-erasure. His job, to exist without reminding anyone that he did. He spoke in tones so hushed they made Gregorian chants sound like punk rock. His emotions were stored in a separate wing of the house, behind 7 locked doors and a broom closet labeled regret. The American butler, however, had a different script. In the States, the Gilded Age was less about tradition and more about aspiration. People weren't born into money, they exploded into it. Think oil barons with insecurity complexes. steel tycoons with brand new pedigrees, and robber barons who genuinely believed Versailles needed more chandeliers. So when these freshly minted millionaires imported European staff to add a little old-world credibility to their new-world furniture, they discovered something inconvenient. British butlers didn't care about your bootstraps origin story. They served dukes, sir, not Cornelius from Pittsburgh. And so, the American version of the butler began to morph. He had to be a little more adaptable, a little more charming, a little more, dare we say it, human, because while the British butler existed to maintain tradition, the American one had to help create the illusion of it. The British model favoured detachment. He was cool, dignified, utterly unflappable. The human equivalent of a perfectly levelled gravy boat. Mistakes were met with mild eyebrow lifts. Praise was considered gauche. Personality was a liability. But in the States? Well, suddenly you were expected to have a rapport, to read your employer's moods, to recommend the right wine for the right guest, all while pretending you didn't notice that the guest was already 3 glasses into the wrong one. You had to smile, tastefully, speak, but not too much, be personable, but never presumptuous. Basically, you had to become a customer service rep in formal wear, with the emotional dexterity of a hostage negotiator. It was exhausting. And, of course, these different expectations bred different kinds of exhaustion. The British butler might suffer under centuries of stifling tradition, but he knew the rules. They were carved in mahogany, the uniform, the bowing angles, the precise temperature of the port. It was crushing, yes, but at least it was predictable. The American butler? He had to freestyle, invent his role anew, with each insecure millionaire. He was performing for people who barely understood the role they'd hired. 1 minute, you're expected to recite the guest list from memory. The next, you're pouring whiskey for a railroad baron who thinks decanting is a French insult. And then there's pay. British butlers were often paid in prestige. Their reward was a quiet room, a respectable uniform, and the vague promise of dying with dignity. American butlers, on the other hand, sometimes made more, but at a cost. Their employers were newer to wealth, and therefore more likely to treat them like very fancy vending machines. I pay you, so I own your time, and possibly your ability to blink on command. Let's pause here. Take that in. 2 different continents. 2 different job descriptions. 1 unifying truth. It sucked either way. Of course, these contrasts became glaringly obvious in households that tried to blend both styles. Imagine an American mansion with a British-trained butler and American staff underneath. The butler glides through the dining room like he's attending a royal funeral, while the maid from Ohio whispers, "Should I tell him the soup's still cold?" It was Downton Abbey meets dollar store melodrama. And just because the British butler had that stiff upper lip reputation, doesn't mean he didn't judge. Oh, he judged. From the eyebrow, from the posture, from the way he handed you your gloves, as if they were a resignation letter, from dignity itself. The American butler, meanwhile, was expected to be a little more flexible, which meant you had to swallow your pride, your sarcasm, and possibly a comment about your employer's third affair, all while coordinating the salad fork placement. Neither side won, because again, this wasn't a competition. It was a comparison between 2 forms of quiet erasure. But perhaps the most painful similarity, both were required to uphold illusions. The British butler sustained the illusion of class, that everything was in its place, untouched by time. The American butler upheld the illusion of success, that this chaotic nouveau riche household was actually a beacon of sophistication. In both cases, the butler was the scaffolding propping up a fantasy. And you don't get credit for scaffolding, you just hold the weight. So next time you see a portrayal of a snarky butler delivering zingers in a tuxedo, remember, behind that smirk was centuries of discomfort, a dozen forms of emotional repression, and probably a bad back from all the bowing. And in the great transatlantic game of pretend, the butler was always losing, politely, professionally, and with perfect posture. You know what's harder than polishing silverware for 8 hours straight? Doing it while your employer's marriage collapses in the next room. Because here's the thing they don't put in the servant manuals. As a butler, you didn't just witness high society, you witnessed its slow, elegant implosion, one whispered scandal at a time. Let's begin with a truth no one wants to admit. Gilded Age households were emotional powder kegs with peacock feather wallpaper. Beneath the pearl necklaces and champagne fountains were simmering resentments, unpaid debts, and affairs so brazen they could have been listed on the menu. And guess who got a front row seat to all of it? Yep, the man pouring the brandy. It usually started quietly, a shift in tone, a decibel too sharp when Lady Chatsworth asked Lord Chatsworth about his late nights at the club. The icy clink of a spoon, stirring tea like it's plotting revenge, and there you are, pretending not to hear it, even though you've memorized every note of this marital symphony of doom. Then came the shouting, but not the theatrical kind. The Gilded Age elite were experts at weaponized politeness. Think venom delivered through a smile, rage disguised as a compliment. Oh darling, your choice in guests tonight is delightfully bold. Translation: why is your mistress here and drinking from my monogrammed glass? Let that sink in. You're standing behind the dining chair of a woman realizing she's been publicly humiliated, and your job is to refill the gravy boat without trembling. You became a silent war correspondent, reporting to no one, recording everything. And when things really hit the fan, when fortunes crumbled, reputations exploded, or someone mysteriously left for Europe indefinitely, it was the butler who stayed. Through the tantrums, the crying, the desperate letter burning in the study, the staff got blamed, the children got confused. But the butler, he had to hold it all together like a human curtain rod. Take the case of Mr. Archibald Greeley, a real-life New York butler in the 1890s, who served a family so obsessed with appearances they continued hosting dinners weeks after declaring bankruptcy. Greeley knew the silver had been hocked. He knew the roast was mostly breadcrumbs and theatrics, but he still announced each course with the solemnity of a state funeral, because that's what butlers did. They carried on the performance long after the stage had burned down. And then there were the deaths. Not the tragic, sudden kind, though those happened too, but the slow, painful variety, the kind where a patriarch with gout slowly lost his grip on both the estate and his sanity, and the butler was the only one who still addressed him with dignity, or the matriarch who, slowly unspooling into grief, found herself talking more to the butler than to her own children. It was an intimacy built on imbalance. You were there for their worst moments, and yet you weren't supposed to exist. Imagine this. You're standing in the drawing room while your employer sobs into a chaise lounge, mascara smudged, dignity gone, and you're holding her tea like a ceremonial torch. You can't offer comfort. You can't speak freely. You can only wait for her to remember that she summoned you in the first place. And the worst part, you still had to iron her husband's shirts the next morning. Now when the entire family finally collapsed, divorce, scandal, bankruptcy, or good old-fashioned disgrace, guess who got to clean up the pieces? Sometimes, literally, letters to be burned, jewelry to be hidden, testimonies to be massaged, and of course, the story to be kept airtight. Because if the butler talked, the illusion crumbled entirely. And let's be honest, some butlers did talk. Eventually, when the money stopped, when loyalty wasn't worth the humiliation, when they were let go with no severance, and a pat on the back that felt more like a slap. There are memoirs, court testimonies, bitter interviews years later. They don't always name names, but they don't have to, because the betrayal wasn't in the telling. It was in how long they stayed silent. You endured. You watched dynasties wither like poorly tended orchids. Children sent away, estates sold off, titles traded for loans. And still, the silver had to sparkle. The fire had to crackle. The door had to be opened with a bow. Let that sink in. You're sweeping the floor while the ceiling caves in. It's one thing to serve people who are stable, dignified, respectable, but to serve people who are falling apart, who know it, and need you to pretend it's not happening, that's a different kind of emotional violence. And yet, many butlers did it for decades. Why? Because the job wasn't just about service. It was about survival. About maintaining structure in a world built on chaos, about being the still point in a spinning room. And that's what made it so brutal. Because even when everything else was collapsing, the marriage, the business, the legacy, you still had to knock twice before entering. Picture this. You've spent 40 years whispering through velvet parlors, tiptoeing around brandy-soaked scandals, and ironing more cummerbunds than there are stars in the sky. And now you get nothing. That's right. No pension, no send-off, not even a decent feather pillow, because in the Gilded Age, Retirement for a butler wasn't a golden swan song. It was more of a soft expiration, a quiet unraveling, like a candlestick burning out in a room no one visits anymore. Let's not pretend this was some elegant fade into a countryside cottage with a dog named Bixby. No, most butlers didn't retire, they just kept going until something gave out. A hip, a lung, the will to keep caring whether the forks were placed at a 30-degree angle, and once they couldn't function, they were let go. A euphemism as cruel as it is vague. Let go where? Into what? The ether. Some ended up in almshouses. Victorian code for go be invisible somewhere else. Others were tossed a few coins and encouraged to rest, which often meant sleeping in their threadbare servant's uniform in a boarding house that smelled like boiled cabbage and regret. Now, for the rare few who served particularly sentimental families, or at least ones with reputations to preserve, they might be allowed to stay on the estate, in the attic, in a room with one window draftier than a politician's promise, and about 3 feet wide, a place where they could be looked after, which basically meant ignored until the next guest asked, "Who's that old man by the pantry?" Let that sink in. You were the cornerstone of a household, the walking etiquette manual, and now you're a ghost haunting the linen closet. Take Mr. Edwin Blakely, a real-life butler who served the same Boston family for over 50 years. When he developed arthritis so severe he could no longer polish silver, they gave him a blanket, moved him to the servant's attic, and paid him in muffins. And when he died, no obituary, no marble plaque, just a footnote in the housekeeper's logbook. Mr. Blakely passed, cleaned room, and even the concept of aging was a bit of a betrayal. The butler was expected to be ageless, stoic, unchanging, but flesh disagrees. Knees protest, vision fades, and suddenly, you're not the flawless fixture anymore. You're the creaky one who drops trays and forgets guest names. That's the other bitter twist. The butler's perfection had an expiration date. You weren't allowed to decline gracefully. Once your usefulness dulled, so did your worth. It didn't matter how loyal you'd been, or how many secrets you'd buried in your waistcoat. The minute you faltered, the clock struck midnight, and poof, you were disposable. And you didn't have savings. How could you? Wages were modest, and any attempts at luxury, a new coat, a decent chair, were frowned upon as above your station. You were supposed to serve wealth, not touch it. So, what happened to those who lived too long? Some became street preachers. Some ended up in servants' hospitals, underfunded relics of Victorian charity. Others simply vanished, like dust swept under the brocade rug. And if you're thinking, well, surely their families looked after them. Oh, sweet summer child. Most butlers didn't have families. You think you can find time for courtship when your employer's dinner party lasts 9 hours, and you're in charge of supervising the soup's emotional temperature. Relationships were discouraged. Children were a liability. Even close friendships among staff were seen as distractions. You weren't building a life. You were maintaining someone else's. And when you finally stopped, when your body gave out, or your employer downsized, what legacy did you leave? A locked drawer of pressed gloves, a monogrammed napkin, maybe a tarnished watch, given on your 40th service anniversary with a note that read, "In appreciation," which is code for goodbye and good luck. Here's the gut punch. A lifetime of elegance, restraint, discipline, and you still died in anonymity. No heirs, no memoir, just a blurry photograph in the back of an estate auction catalogue. And yet, some butlers stayed until the end, knowing this would be the outcome. They served with quiet pride, maybe because they saw it as duty, maybe because they didn't know anything else, or maybe, just maybe, because they believed that someone had to hold the line, that someone had to keep the silver polished, even if no one ever noticed. So yeah, breathe that in, dust and all. You gave everything. And when you finally asked for nothing, that's exactly what you got. But you were always punctual, even for your own irrelevance. Yes, the pop culture butler. A charming enigma in a tailcoat who always has the answer, the wine, the monocle-level judgment, and the perfect quip loaded like a silver bullet. From Alfred to Jeeves, from Carson in Downton Abbey to Geoffrey from Fresh Prince, media has served us a deliciously curated version of what it means to be a butler. But here's the thing, those portrayals? Sanitized, airbrushed, served with a doily, and about as historically accurate as a corset on a golden retriever. Let's start with the archetype. The snarky, hyper-competent butler, who's somehow smarter than everyone in the room, but deeply fulfilled by folding napkins into swans. Think Jeeves, the ultimate fixer who outsmarts his employer, while never actually stepping outside the role of obedient servant. It's fantasy. A kind of servile Sherlock Holmes in starched cotton. Then there's Alfred, Batman's endlessly loyal right-hand man, tactical medic, childhood caretaker, moral compass, father figure, dry wit machine, and full-time tea steward. He's a one-man Swiss Army knife of emotional labor and dry sarcasm, apparently powered by sheer dignity and Earl Grey. But you know what Alfred never does? Complain, break down, snap after cleaning Bruce Wayne's third blood-stained tuxedo of the week. That kind of repression belongs in a museum next to the Batmobile. And don't get me started on Downton Abbey, the Netflix-scented opiate for middle-class nostalgia. The show gives us Mr. Carson, a man so married to duty he could probably iron shirts using his jawline alone. He's stern but secretly soft, repressed but noble, always upright, always composed. It's beautiful television. But it's also the butler myth, poured into a crystal decanter and served with a string quartet. Because here's what we rarely see in these portrayals: the exhaustion, the fear, the random firings, the mental toll of being invisible yet omnipresent. Pop culture doesn't show a butler scrubbing the same brass railing for 6 hours because a guest might glance at it and say, smudgy. It doesn't show the tears suppressed behind the pantry door after being screamed at for delivering a letter 2 minutes late, or the contortions of someone trying to maintain grace while their joints scream from a decade of carrying silver trays up spiral staircases. Instead, we get dignity without bitterness, pride without exhaustion, loyalty without trauma. It's historical fan fiction, where servitude comes with health benefits and a subplot. Even when butlers are depicted as tragic, they're made poetic, noble martyrs to tradition. We watch them fade into obscurity, violins swelling in the background. We're meant to think, how elegant, instead of, that man just died of loneliness and chronic ankle pain. And why do we buy into this sanitized myth so eagerly? Because it makes us feel better about hierarchy, about class, about the idea that some people were just meant to serve. If the butler is always smiling, always fulfilled, always wise and emotionally whole, then surely there's no tragedy in servitude. Right? Wrong. The truth is, for every clever Alfred, there were hundreds of real-life butlers like James Trask, who served a railroad baron's family for 30 years, only to be fired after spilling gravy on a guest's cuff, or Charles Emery, dismissed at 62 for being too deaf to hear the bell pull, after decades of loyal silence. No retirement, no recourse, just gone. And let's not forget how media constantly glosses over race and gender in these depictions. In the US, many domestic workers, especially during the Gilded Age and after, were people of color. But where are their stories in the glossy costume dramas? Where's the butler navigating both racial discrimination and household politics without so much as a sigh? Nowhere, because it doesn't fit the fantasy. Even when the butler is given depth, like Stevens in The Remains of the Day, it's depth within a cage, emotional complexity wrapped in starched linen. You never see the explosion, just the quiet resignation. And yet, there is a strange kind of power in these myths, because buried inside all the pearl-polished portrayals is a truth that does matter. The butler as the eternal observer, the one who sees without being seen, who knows the truth of every affair, every downfall, every whispered ambition behind closed doors. That, at least, isn't fiction, it's legacy. So here's the rub. Pop culture didn't invent the butler myth. It just preserved the version we were most comfortable with. The dignified ghost who glides through history, never angry, never tired, always 3 steps behind, and somehow still ahead of everyone else. But real butlers, they bled, they aged, they hurt, they mattered, even if their names were left off the estate's history. So next time you watch some posh period drama and sigh at the poise of the man serving pudding in slow motion, just remember, there's probably a story behind that bow tie, and it's not all quips and cutlery. There is a particular kind of silence that hums beneath history. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of acknowledgement. That's where butlers lived, in the soft edges of grand narratives, in the gaps between champagne toasts and estate collapses, invisible but essential, and maybe just a little furious about it. You see, the Gilded Age wasn't merely an era of opulence. It was an age powered by denial. Denial that someone had to keep the candles lit, the linen crisp, the gossip quiet. And while the Vanderbilts and Astors made headlines, their butlers were becoming ghosts in their own lifetimes, trained not just to serve but to vanish, to walk without echo, to think without showing it on their faces. And yet, within this enforced invisibility, there was dignity, not the polished kind, worn for guests, but the battered, weathered dignity of someone who has seen everything, endured everything, and still manages to get the silverware aligned to regulation. These were not saints. These were not caricatures. These were men, and yes, occasionally women, with backs that ached, tempers they swallowed, and lives they folded away behind pantry doors. Theirs was not the stoicism of nobility, but the survival instinct of someone whose livelihood depended on never ever flinching. Consider the butler who watched the family fortune vanish overnight in a stock market crash, but still served breakfast with a pressed collar and not a word out of place. Or the man who discovered his employer's affair, not by accident, but because he arranged the flowers for the secret rendezvous, and then went back to polishing the candlesticks. These were the quiet witnesses of collapse, emotional, financial, sometimes literal, and they stayed. Because they had to. Because they had nowhere else to go. Because silence for them wasn't just loyalty. It was currency. And make no mistake, beneath that silence there was rage. Not the loud kind, but the slow-burning fury of 1,000 swallowed insults, of being asked to fetch water while your knees screamed, of being mistaken for the footman again, of hearing your employer complain about exhaustion while you prepared their footbath at 6 a.m. The quiet rage of watching generations of wealth rise and fall, knowing that your own name would never be etched into any family tree or painted above any mantle. And yet, despite it all, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, of resistance. A too-tight waistcoat loosened ever so slightly, a knowing glance exchanged with the cook, a subtle reshuffling of place cards at dinner that put Cousin Percy next to the woman he loathed. These were not grand revolts. They were whispers of rebellion, enough to remind themselves they were human, not prop. Because here's the hard truth. For all their invisibility, butlers shaped the rhythm of entire households. They were the pulse behind the pomp, the reason a dinner party didn't collapse into chaos, the reason guests never saw the cracks in the ceiling or the blood on the family crest. They mattered, even when history refused to say so. And if you listen closely, really closely, you can still hear them, in the creak of old mansion stairs, in the faint smell of silver polish, in the tradition of absolute composure, passed down like a cursed heirloom. We like to romanticize the past. We wrap hardship in nostalgia and call it grace. But beneath every feather duster and folded napkin, there was a person, with calluses, with thoughts, with a whole life you'll never see on screen. So maybe, just maybe, it's time to rewrite the ending. To acknowledge that dignity doesn't always wear a smile. Sometimes, it wears gloves, and it grips a teapot with trembling hands. And it keeps going anyway. And that, quietly, invisibly, is what makes it heroic. Let that sink in. Let it settle into the velvet silence these butlers once occupied. The invisible class. The ones who endured, who observed, who were there. Always. Even if the world chose to look the other way. Their stories didn't end at the pantry door. And neither should ours. If you made it through this quietly devastating tour of cutlery, classism, and crushed dreams, maybe give that subscribe button the respect it deserves. After all, unlike the Gilded Age elite, we see you, and no bell pull is required. Just click, quietly,